Explorer Noah Bennett caught in tiger's ferocious grip. Noah's heart raced as he gasped for breath, his back pressed hard against the thick trunk of a towering tree. His eyes darted frantically through the dense underbrush, searching for any sign of movement. But the jungle was deathly quiet now, the calm before the storm. Sweat dripped from his brow, stinging his eyes, but he barely noticed. His pulse thudded in his ears like a war drum, drowning out every other sound. His chest heaved with every breath, a futile attempt to steady his trembling hands. The predator was close. He could feel it even if he couldn't see it. He tightened his grip around the thick, makeshift spear he had fashioned moments earlier, a broken branch stripped of its leaves, sharpened against a jagged rock. It was crude, hardly a match for the beast stalking him, but it was all he had. His mind raced through the events that had led him here. He'd been in dangerous situations before, but never like this. Never so vulnerable, so utterly at the mercy of something far more powerful than himself. A low, guttural growl rumbled through the jungle, sending a shiver down his spine. He clenched his jaw, his knuckles whitening around the spear. The growl seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath his feet, primal and unforgiving. His instincts screamed at him to run, but he knew better. Running was a death sentence. Predators like this thrived on the chase, and Noah would be nothing more than easy prey if he fled. He pressed his back harder against the tree, trying to disappear into its rough bark, his breathing shallow now. His eyes flicked toward a tangle of ferns several meters ahead. The undergrowth rustled slightly, just enough to confirm what he already knew. It was there, hidden in the shadows, waiting, watching. He could almost feel its eyes locked on him, calculating its next move. The tiger stepped out of the shadows, its massive frame emerging from the foliage with a quiet, lethal grace. Its amber eyes glowed in the fading light, unblinking, unwavering. Muscles rippled beneath its sleek, striped coat as it moved, each step deliberate, confident. This was its domain, and Noah was the intruder. He couldn't help but admire the creature, even in his terror. It was magnificent, a perfect blend of beauty and power, a relic of a wild world that most people never saw beyond the pages of glossy magazines. But admiration wouldn't save him now. He tightened his grip on the spear, every muscle in his body coiled like a spring, ready to react at the slightest movement. The tiger halted a few feet away, its gaze never leaving him. For a brief, surreal moment, time seemed to stand still. It was just the two of them, locked in a silent standoff. Noah's breath caught in his throat. He knew how these encounters usually ended. He'd seen enough documentaries to understand that if the tiger decided to attack, it would be over in seconds. His mind flashed through every survival tip he'd ever read, but they all seemed laughably inadequate now. Stay calm. Make yourself appear larger. Maintain eye contact. He repeated the advice in his mind like a mantra, clinging to it as though it were a lifeline. Slowly, carefully, he raised his arms, spreading them wide to make himself look bigger. His heart pounded so violently in his chest that he feared it might burst. The tiger's eyes flicked to his raised arms, its ears twitching slightly. It took a step closer, its massive paws sinking silently into the damp earth. Noah swallowed hard, fighting the rising tide of panic threatening to consume him. His mind screamed at him to run, to climb the tree, to do anything but stand there like a statue. But he knew that a single wrong move could trigger the tiger's instinct to pounce. The air felt thick, heavy with tension. Each second stretched into an eternity. Noah's muscles burned from holding his arms aloft, but he dared not lower them. His eyes remained locked on the tiger's, unblinking, unyielding. His breath came in shallow gasps, his body trembling with the effort of staying still. Then, without warning, the tiger let out a low snarl, its lips curling back to reveal long, deadly fangs. Its eyes narrowed, and Noah felt the full weight of its gaze, predatory and unforgiving. His grip on the spear tightened until his knuckles turned white. His mind raced, searching for a way out, a strategy, anything that could give him a chance to survive. His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden movement to his left. a bird taking flight from a nearby tree, its wings beating frantically as it disappeared into the sky. The tiger's eyes flicked toward the sound, just for a split second. Noah's instincts kicked in, and he seized the opportunity. He thrust the spear forward with all his strength, aiming for the tiger's shoulder. It wasn't a killing blow, but it might buy him a few precious seconds. The tiger roared in fury as the spear struck home, its powerful muscles convulsing in pain. Noah didn't wait to see the aftermath. He turned and ran, his feet pounding against the forest floor, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The jungle blurred around him, a chaotic tangle of green and brown. Branches whipped at his face, roots threatened to trip him, but he didn't slow down. Behind him, the tiger's roar echoed through the trees, a terrifying reminder that the chase was far from over. Noah's lungs burned, his legs screaming in protest, but he pushed himself harder. He had no choice. It was run or die. Noah's legs burned as he sprinted through the dense jungle, his breath tearing through his chest in ragged gasps. Each step felt heavier than the last, his body screaming for him to stop. But he couldn't. He didn't dare. The tiger's roar echoed behind him, a chilling reminder of the deadly force pursuing him. Leaves slapped against his face, branches clawed at his arms, and the ground beneath him felt like an unpredictable trap, littered with hidden roots and jagged rocks. His foot caught on an exposed root, sending him crashing to the ground. Pain shot through his knee as he hit the dirt hard. The wind knocked from his lungs. For a moment, he lay there stunned, his mind caught in a haze of panic and pain. But then he heard it, the soft, deliberate crunch of footsteps in the undergrowth. The tiger was close, too close. His pulse quickened, panic surging through him like wildfire. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the throbbing in his leg, and forced himself to keep moving. His mind raced, grasping for a plan. He couldn't outrun the tiger forever, he knew that much. The jungle was its home, its hunting ground. Every tree, every shadow was an advantage for the predator. But Noah wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. He had come too far, risked too much to let it all end like this. He needed to think, to outsmart the tiger somehow. He veered sharply to the right, his eyes scanning the landscape for anything that could help him. A fallen tree, a river, a cliff, something. Then he saw it. A massive banyan tree with thick, sprawling roots and a hollow at its base. It wasn't much, but it might be enough to buy him time. Without hesitation, he dove toward the tree, crawling into the hollow and curling into a tight ball. He pressed his back against the rough bark, his chest heaving, his entire body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The jungle fell silent again, an eerie calm settling over the landscape. Noah strained to hear any sound, any indication of the tiger's movements. His ears caught the faint rustle of leaves, the soft padding of footsteps drawing nearer. His breath caught in his throat. The tiger was close, so close that he could almost feel its presence, a heavy weight pressing down on the air around him. He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. Every muscle in his body was taut, ready to spring into action at the slightest provocation. Time seemed to stretch, each second dragging on for an eternity. His mind flashed back to the beginning of his journey, to the moments that had led him to this life-or-death standoff. It had all started 3 months ago, when he had first received the invitation to join the expedition. Noah had been between projects at the time, restless and eager for a new challenge. The offer had seemed almost too good to be true. A chance to document a rare and elusive species of tiger in one of the most remote and uncharted regions of the world. The expedition promised adventure, danger, and the kind of once-in-a-lifetime experience that every explorer dreamed of. He remembered sitting in his apartment that night, the invitation clutched in his hands, a fire already burning in his chest. His friends had called him reckless, warning him that the jungle was no place for a solo expedition. But Noah had laughed it off, dismissing their concerns with the kind of confidence that bordered on arrogance. He had survived worse, he had told them. He knew how to handle himself in the wild. But as he sat in the hollow of the banyan tree, listening to the tiger circle nearby, he couldn't help but think back to those warnings. His confidence now felt like a distant memory, a naive echo from a different life. Here, in the heart of the jungle, surrounded by shadows and teeth, he was no longer the fearless explorer. He was just a man, fragile and breakable, clinging to the fragile thread of survival. A low growl rumbled through the air, snapping him back to the present. His heart slammed against his ribs, his breath catching in his throat. The tiger was right outside the hollow, its massive paws barely a few feet from where he crouched. Noah pressed himself deeper into the tree, his body trembling with the effort to remain still. His fingers brushed against a rock, half buried in the dirt. He closed his hand around it, gripping it tightly. It wasn't much, but it was something, a last-ditch defense if it came to that. The tiger's eyes appeared in the opening of the hollow, glowing like twin orbs of amber in the dim light. It stared at him, unblinking, its gaze piercing and relentless. Noah's breath came in shallow, silent gasps, his entire body frozen in place. His mind raced, searching for a way out, a way to survive. Seconds stretched into minutes, the tension so thick it felt like a physical force pressing down on him. His muscles burned from holding still, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from his chest. The tiger seemed to study him, its eyes never leaving his. Then, slowly, it began to back away, its massive body disappearing into the shadows once more. Noah stayed perfectly still, his breath caught in his throat. He waited for what felt like an eternity, his ears straining for any sound, any sign that the tiger was still nearby. The jungle remained silent, the only sound the distant rustle of leaves in the wind. Finally, after what felt like hours, Noah allowed himself to breathe again. His body sagged with relief, his muscles trembling with exhaustion. He had survived barely, but he knew the danger wasn't over. The tiger was still out there somewhere, and it wouldn't give up easily. He needed a plan. He needed to find a way out of the jungle before it was too late. Noah forced himself to stay in the hollow for a few more minutes, his breath still ragged and his heart pounding in his chest. His mind raced, piecing together his next move. He couldn't stay hidden forever. Eventually, the tiger would circle back, more determined and possibly more aggressive. Every instinct screamed at him to move, fast but carefully. The jungle was a labyrinth of danger, and every step carried its own risk. He wiped the sweat from his brow, his hand trembling slightly. His knee throbbed from the earlier fall, and his muscles ached with exhaustion, but the adrenaline pumping through his veins kept him moving. Cautiously, he crawled out from the hollow, his eyes scanning his surroundings for any sign of movement. The jungle was eerily quiet, save for the distant hum of insects. The tiger was gone, for now. Noah knew he had to gain higher ground. The trees stretched endlessly into the sky, their thick branches intertwining like a canopy overhead. If he could climb one, he might have a better chance of spotting the tiger before it spotted him. It was a risky plan, one wrong move and he could fall, but staying on the ground seemed even riskier. He spotted a sturdy tree with low-hanging branches and made his way toward it, his footsteps light and deliberate. Every snap of a twig beneath his feet sent a jolt of panic through his chest, but he pressed on. Grabbing hold of the lowest branch, he hoisted himself up, his arms burning with effort. Slowly, methodically, he climbed higher and higher, his eyes never leaving the forest floor below. As he settled onto a thick branch about 15 feet off the ground, he finally allowed himself a moment to breathe. His body sagged with exhaustion, but his mind remained sharp, alert. From his perch, he had a better view of the surrounding jungle. He scanned the area, searching for any movement, any flicker of orange and black among the greenery. For a while, there was nothing, just the gentle rustle of leaves in the wind. Noah leaned back against the trunk of the tree, his breath finally slowing. His thoughts drifted back to the beginning of the expedition, to the days before everything had gone so horribly wrong. He had arrived in the jungle with high hopes and an air of confidence. The expedition had been meticulously planned, or so he'd thought. He had the latest equipment, detailed maps, and months of preparation under his belt. He had even hired a local guide, a quiet but experienced man named Kieran, who had warned him about the dangers of venturing too deep into the jungle. Kieran had tried to convince him to stick to safer areas, but Noah had been determined. He wasn't interested in photographing butterflies or documenting common species. He wanted something extraordinary, something that would set him apart from every other explorer. And when he had heard about the rumored tiger that roamed these parts, a rare and elusive predator known for its size and ferocity, he knew he had found his prize. He could still hear Kieran's voice in his head, warning him on the last day they'd spoken. "This jungle does not forgive mistakes," Kieran had said, his eyes dark with concern. "It doesn't care who you are or how experienced you think you are. Respect it or it will break you." Noah had brushed off the warning at the time, confident in his ability to handle whatever the jungle threw at him. But now, as he sat in the tree, scanning the shadows for any sign of the tiger, Kieran's words echoed in his mind with a chilling clarity. The jungle was a predator in its own right, and it had already brought him to the edge of survival. A sudden rustling below snapped him back to the present. His eyes darted toward the sound, his pulse quickening once again. The underbrush parted, and for a split second, he thought the tiger had returned. But it was something else, something even more unsettling. It was a smaller animal, a deer or an antelope, its eyes wide with panic as it stumbled through the foliage. Its chest heaved, its flanks slick with sweat, as if it had been running for its life. Noah watched in silence, his heart sinking as he realized what this meant. The deer wasn't running from him. It was running from something else. His stomach tightened with dread. The tiger was still hunting. It was close and it wasn't done. The deer froze beneath the tree, its ears swiveling toward an unseen sound. Its body trembled, every muscle coiled like a spring, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. Then, with a sudden burst of movement, it darted off into the jungle, disappearing into the shadows. Noah's eyes remained locked on the spot where the deer had stood, his breath caught in his throat. He strained to hear anything, any rustle, any growl, but the jungle was silent once more. His fingers dug into the bark of the tree, his knuckles white. Minutes passed, each one feeling like an eternity. Noah's muscles ached from holding himself so still, but he didn't dare move. His eyes flicked from shadow to shadow, his mind replaying every survival lesson he had ever learned. Stay alert, conserve your energy, never let your guard down. Just when he thought the danger might have passed, a low, rumbling growl echoed through the trees, deeper and more menacing than before. The tiger was back. This time, it wasn't just circling. It was hunting him, specifically him. Noah's breath hitched, his body tensing like a coiled spring. He had to act fast. He couldn't wait for the tiger to reach the base of the tree. Climbing higher wasn't an option. The branches above were too thin to support his weight. He needed a distraction, something to draw the tiger away and buy himself a few precious moments. His eyes darted to his backpack, still slung over his shoulder. It was bulky, filled with supplies he had thought would help him survive in the jungle. Maps, rations, a flare gun. The flare gun. His heart leapt at the thought. It was risky, but it might be his only chance. He pulled the flare gun from his pack, his fingers trembling as he loaded a cartridge. Taking a deep breath, he aimed it toward a distant clump of bushes and pulled the trigger. The flare shot out with a loud hiss, arcing through the air before exploding in a burst of red light. It lit up the jungle like a miniature sun, casting long shadows across the trees. The tiger roared in response, its growl blending with the crackle of the flare. Noah watched as it moved toward the light, its powerful body disappearing into the undergrowth. His heart pounded with relief, but he knew it was only a temporary solution. He needed to move now. Noah lowered the flare gun, his breath still caught in his chest, and wiped his forehead with a trembling hand. The burst of red light lingered in the air, illuminating the jungle in an eerie glow before fading into darkness once again. His heart thundered, adrenaline pumping through his veins, but he knew this was no time for rest. The tiger was distracted for the moment, but that moment wouldn't last long. He climbed down from the tree, his muscles aching and his knees screaming in protest. Every movement felt heavier, slower, but he forced himself to keep going. The ground felt unstable beneath his feet, the jungle pressing in on him from all sides like a living, breathing entity. Noah's senses were on high alert, every sound and shadow sending jolts of panic through his system. He needed a plan. The flare had bought him time, but it wasn't enough. His thoughts raced as he scanned his surroundings. His mind replayed survival techniques and advice from past expeditions, lessons learned from years of exploring the most dangerous places on Earth. The key to survival was distance. He had to get far enough ahead to break the tiger's pursuit entirely. A river. If he could find a river, it would mask his scent and give him a fighting chance. He remembered passing a creek earlier in the day, though in his current state of exhaustion and panic, it felt like a lifetime ago. Still, it was his best bet. He turned in the direction he thought it might be and started moving, his footsteps quick and deliberate. Every step felt like a gamble. The jungle was a maze of thick vines, ancient roots, and towering trees that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. Time blurred as he stumbled forward, his eyes darting constantly, his body tense with anticipation. Every sound, the crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves, felt like the prelude to another attack. The sound of running water reached his ears, faint but unmistakable. Relief surged through him, giving him a second wind. He pushed through the undergrowth, ignoring the sharp branches that tore at his arms and legs. The creek appeared in front of him, its waters dark and swift, cutting a narrow path through the jungle. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Without hesitation, he waded into the water, the cool current swirling around his ankles. The water rose quickly, soaking him to the waist, but he welcomed the sensation. It was grounding, a stark contrast to the chaos that had consumed him moments before. He followed the creek downstream, his steps cautious but steady, his eyes scanning the jungle on both sides. The tiger's growl echoed in the distance, closer than he would have liked. Noah clenched his jaw, his pulse quickening once again. He pressed on, each step feeling like a battle against time. His mind calculated distances, probabilities, and escape routes with a precision born of desperation. The creek widened, its waters deepening as it merged with a larger river. Noah paused, his eyes narrowing as he studied the riverbank. He needed to cross to the other side and find higher ground. Staying in the water too long was a risk. If the tiger caught his scent again, it could ambush him from the shore. He glanced up and down the river, searching for a shallow crossing point. A cluster of rocks jutted out of the water a few meters downstream, forming a rough path to the opposite bank. It was risky, but it was his best option. He moved toward the rocks, his steps deliberate, the river's current tugging at his legs. His feet slipped on the slick stones, but he steadied himself, his arms outstretched for balance. He reached the third rock when the growl came again, low, menacing, and far too close. Noah froze, his breath caught in his throat. He turned slowly, his eyes sweeping the riverbank behind him. The tiger stood there, its golden eyes locked on him, its muscles coiled like a spring ready to launch. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Time seemed to hang suspended between them, the river rushing around Noah in a deafening roar. His mind raced, weighing his options. The distance between him and the shore was too great to cover before the tiger could reach him. Jumping into the river and letting the current carry him downstream was an option, but a dangerous one. If the current didn't drown him, the rocks surely would. The tiger took a step closer, its paws sinking into the muddy riverbank. Noah's pulse skyrocketed, his hands tightening into fists. His body screamed at him to run, to fight, to do something, but he held his ground. He knew the tiger was testing him, watching for a moment of weakness. He inhaled deeply, forcing himself to calm the storm inside him. Slowly, he reached into his backpack, his fingers searching for the flare gun once again. His hand closed around it, the cool metal reassuring in his grip. He raised it slowly, aiming it at the tiger. The tiger growled again, its eyes narrowing. Its body tensed, its claws digging into the earth. Noah's finger hovered over the trigger, his mind calculating every possible outcome. If he fired the flare too soon, it might not scare the tiger off. If he waited too long, it might be too late. The moment stretched, every second a lifetime. The tiger shifted its weight, its tail flicking behind it. Noah's eyes remained locked on it, his breath shallow and controlled. He whispered to himself, a quiet mantra to steady his nerves. Come on. Just a little closer. The tiger took another step, its eyes burning with intensity. Noah's finger tightened on the trigger. Every muscle in his body coiled like a spring. He knew this was it, the moment that would decide everything. His heartbeat slowed, the world narrowing to the space between him and the beast in front of him. Then, with a sudden burst of motion, the tiger lunged. Noah fired the flare at the same instant, the red-hot light arcing through the air in a streak of fire. The tiger twisted mid-leap, its powerful body narrowly avoiding the flare as it crashed into the river with a deafening splash. The water erupted around it, the current dragging it downstream as it thrashed and roared. Noah didn't wait to see the outcome. He turned and bolted across the remaining rocks, his feet slipping and sliding but never stopping. He reached the opposite bank and scrambled up the muddy slope, his hands digging into the earth for support. His lungs burned, his body screaming for rest, but he forced himself onward. The tiger's roars faded into the distance, swallowed by the roar of the river. Noah collapsed onto the forest floor, his chest heaving, his vision swimming. His entire body trembled with exhaustion, but a weak smile tugged at the corners of his lips. He had survived. Noah collapsed onto the flat surface of the outcrop, his chest heaving with exhaustion. His muscles screamed in protest, but he forced himself to sit up, his eyes scanning the vast jungle that stretched endlessly before him. The river twisted below, the water sparkling in the fading light of the setting sun. For the first time in hours, he allowed himself to breathe. His clothes hung in tatters, his body bruised and bloodied, but he was alive. Somehow, he had survived not through strength but through sheer instinct and luck. The tiger was gone, swept downstream by the rushing river, but its presence still lingered in his mind like a shadow. He had never been so close to death, never so humbled. The memory of its eyes locked onto his flashed through his thoughts. The raw power, the grace. It wasn't a mindless beast. It was a guardian of the wild, fighting for its place in a world that refused to be tamed. Noah felt a strange connection now, a shared understanding between predator and prey. He leaned back, watching the sky shift from fiery orange to soft pink and purple. Kieran's words echoed in his mind. Respect it, or it will break you. At the time, he had dismissed the warning, too confident in his skills. But now he understood. The jungle wasn't something to be conquered. It was ancient, powerful, and untouchable. It had tested him and spared him. He smiled weakly, running a hand through his dirt-matted hair. He hadn't won. This wasn't a victory. The tiger had given him a second chance, and he would honor it. He had come seeking adventure, something to set him apart from other explorers. What he found was something far greater, respect for the untamed. The sun sank lower, casting golden beams through the treetops. It was a cruel beauty after the chaos, a reminder of the jungle's indifference. Noah stood, his body protesting every movement, and looked out at the horizon one last time. Somewhere out there, the tiger was still alive, still thriving, a symbol of the wild's resilience. His steps were slow and deliberate as he began the descent from the outcrop. Every step felt like a promise, to leave this place behind and never forget what he had learned. He had survived, but not because the jungle had lost. It had simply allowed him to leave. As the shadows closed in around him, Noah disappeared into the depths of the jungle, humbled but alive. Behind him, the wild reclaimed its space, timeless and unyielding, its secrets once again hidden beneath the canopy.